We're going to continue talking about the CNS physiology. Previously we talked about the brain's requirements of oxygen and glucose, which are the constituents that create ATP through the process of glycolysis in the TCA cycle. And this energy was used and is used for the neuroelectrical activity of the brain, as well as maintaining the cellular integrity of the brain tissue. And we illustrated that earlier in the previous chapter and lecture. Then we talked about the cerebral blood flow. And the average cerebral blood flow for the average adult brain, we said, is approximately 750 mLs of blood per minute. And it was through the blood that oxygen and glucose are supplied to the brain. And then we mentioned the three major influencing factors being cerebral perfusion pressure, cerebral autoregulation, and certain extrinsic factors that help to try to provide adequate cerebral blood flow. Now we're going to focus on what happens to the brain when the cerebral blood flow no longer adequately supplies the brain with enough oxygen and glucose. And we're going to focus mainly on the oxygen supply versus the oxygen demand. So if we were to say that the cerebral blood flow now begins to diminish and no longer supplies the brain with approximately 750 mLs of blood per minute, and now begins to decline to perhaps even 300 mLs of blood per minute, the brain will now start to suffer from a cerebral ischemia, in which the oxygen supply no longer meets the oxygen demand. And so what happens is you no longer are able to produce ATP in the fashion that we were producing before, meaning 38 ATP for every glucose molecule that was oxidized through the glycolysis and TCA cycle. So now, because of the lack of oxygen, we now start to begin to produce only approximately 2 ATP versus the 38 ATP we were once producing. And now this ATP is no longer enough and sufficient to drive the neuroelectrical activity as well as maintaining the cellular integrity. And it can see that the sodium ion concentrations within the cells no longer are being pumped out through the sodium-potassium ion pump. And the sodium concentrations within the cell begin to progressively increase in concentration intracellularly. And what happens is water begins to enter these cells through the oncotic pressure, and cellular swelling begins to take place within the nerve tissue. And that creates cerebral edema. And as the cerebral edema worsens, the cellular integrity also begins to leak. And now that gives the chance for sodium, which previously was only able to enter the cell through either the voltage-gated ion channels or exit through the cells through the pumps. But now the cellular integrity is worsened or inhibited, and now sodium is able to pass through these leaky sodium channel, or rather not channels but cell membranes, and the concentration of sodium within the cell begins to increase, and water again follows the oncotic pressure, and the swelling of the cell worsens, and the cerebral edema takes place. So once again we can see cerebral ischemia occurs when the cerebral blood flow no longer supplies the adequate oxygen supply which meets the brain's oxygen demand. ATP production becomes inhibited and no longer can maintain the neuroelectrical activity, for example the sodium ion potassium pumps, as well as no longer maintains the intact cellular membrane integrity. Water begins to follow the oncotic pressure that takes place with the increasing sodium intracellular concentrations. And with the cerebral edema, it generally tends to increase the intracranial pressure because the cranial vault is a fixed rigid container, and as the volume of blood or the volume of cellular swelling increases, the cranial vault becomes a more and more tighter space, and the intracranial pressure begins to increase. As you increase the intracranial pressure, the cerebral perfusion begins to decline as the intracranial pressure continues to increase. And with the decreasing cerebral perfusion pressure, along with the increasing intracranial pressure, there tends to be a vicious cycle in which, if not corrected, and if this continues, there's chance of brain herniation. So we'll look at greater detail what happens when cerebral blood flow declines and you can no longer produce the 38 ATP we were once producing through glycolysis and TCA, and now only producing approximately 2 ATP, which is no longer enough to supply the sodium-potassium ion pumps. And now you have an altered ion pump function. We talked about the sodium concentrations increasing and drawing water into the cell, creating cerebral swelling or cerebral edema. Likewise, there's an increase in calcium concentration within the cell. And the increased calcium concentration stimulates the proteases, phospholipases, and increases the level of arachidonic acid within the cell. And as these proteases take place, the increased stimulation of proteases eventually leads to protease or protein breakdown, an increase in protein breakdown. Likewise, the phospholipases increase the free fatty acids within the cell. And these two combined generally increase the free radical damage, which ultimately is going to affect the cell membrane function as well. And if you were to reestablish the cerebral blood flow, there's a concept considered as reperfusion injury. And the echonocytes that are produced, as well as the arachidonic acid, stimulate thromboxane, which basically stimulates a vasoconstriction and further decreases the cerebral blood flow. Likewise, the leukotrienes increase the cerebral edema. So ultimately, a necrotic process is going to take place that leads to ultimate cell death through the disintegration of the cell structure, stimulation of the immune response, and all the leading processes that take place that ultimately lead to cell death. So this is the process that we mentioned before, that as the cerebral blood flow declines, no longer meets the oxygen demand, you're no longer going to produce the ATP that's required to maintain the cellular neuroelectrical activity and to maintain the cellular integrity. The sodium ion pumps, the sodium-potassium ion pumps, no longer work efficiently because of the lack of ATP. The increased sodium ion concentrations intracellular within the cell draws the water through the oncotic pressure, cellular swelling takes place, and as the cellular swelling takes place, you're going to have increased cranial pressure that takes place, further compromises the cerebral perfusion pressure, and ultimately reduces and further decreases your cerebral blood flow, and you're going to get a vicious cycle that takes place if the contributing factors are no longer taken care of.